Hi, folks. Here we are today. We're going to have a little experiment at doing a cross-generational chat about life in architecture. So we thought we'd take some extremes and do a Gen Z chatting to a boomer. No prizes for guessing who the boomer is, and I'll introduce Zoe Gar here, one of our Gen Z
Hello.
architects in the practice. We're just going to have a chat about life and ambitions and hopes and fears and how it's all working out for both of us. See if that's interesting for everybody. So I'll kick off. Um, you're reasonably fresh out of university,
Yes, I am. 1 year.
1 year. Okay,
hmm
so a year's experience in the real world of architecture. Did you think, looking back, that university was a good prep for real life?
I think so. I think there's definitely an element of rigor in university, especially studying architecture, that applies to real life and being in the career because there's a lot of time and a lot of effort spent within the office every day working on drawings. There's also an element of collaboration that you learn at uni, especially at studio. I think being privileged to have enough that like the experience definitely prepares you for the office. There's definitely a side of architecture in terms of like business law and practice management side that you don't necessarily get a lot of experience on. But when you come into practice, that will feed into your workday naturally. And then that way it sort of assimilates into your knowledge and you're able to grow in that sense quite easily alongside it. Like there's definitely a lot of theory that you don't know and you're not prepared for, and you will not know it to the as much detail as any directors or anything. But there's a level of knowledge that you gain just through being in the office. And I think that uni prepares you for that quite well.
Okay, so well, for me it was pure design theory, and I found that working was a real shock because you say you didn't really know much about construction,
Mm.
particularly law, particularly contracts.
Yeah.
So do you think they got the balance right? It's appropriate that you pick that up when you start working?
I think so. I mean, like as a part one, you're not necessarily hands-on in that, and you're kind of far from being hands-on in that situation. But it's always nice to have that sort of knowledge. I think also maybe one of the limitations of university is that you're sort of given this creative freedom, and sometimes it can provide you with a false pretense on what you're actually walking into as a part one architectural assistant. Because in no way, shape, or form are you ever going to manage a project by yourself and be able to do design with no limits. And I think that's something that you need to be prepared to walk into when you come out of university, and knowing that you may have had all this fun and it is still fun, but maybe just a bit more focused on the reality of what you're trying to build.
So has the reality lived up to your expectations after a year?
I think it has. I mean, I was lucky enough to do placements prior to this, so I kind of already knew what I was walking into. And I think sports architecture is quite a good niche that I was able to find and be involved in because um, I just think that there's just so much of architecture that you don't think about, and sports architecture especially, because it's quite cool and you work with a lot of interesting clients, and it's just a sort of different experience of architecture, I think. Yeah.
It is good, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think we're quite lucky at KSS that we work in sports architecture.
Yeah.
Um, when you get into networking, you find you keep meeting people, and they're
hmm
always when they find out what you do. You say you're an architect, you work in sports architecture. You,
hmm
you suddenly become the coolest person in the room.
Yeah,
It's really
definitely.
good. Everyone's envious.
Yeah.
Are your friends and colleagues sort of envious of what you do?
I think so. There's definitely an idea around architecture that everyone envies. They think you're just like, the world is literally in the palm of your hand. Like you can do anything you want because you have all the creative ideas and you know everything and you can build everything. So I think it's quite an interesting personality trait to have. And it's definitely a good conversation starter in any social situation. So I don't think that's something to be taken for granted because it's a very interesting career.
Yeah.
Yeah. Obviously, I'm at the start of my architectural career, so there's not a lot I can look back on as of right now, other than my uni work. But since you're quite far along it, what do you think you're most proud of, and what do you think are the highlights?
I love the expression. You're quite far along it. That's very very polite. As I near the end of my career in mid 60s, although of course architects can go on and on. Yes, I suppose I got a lot to look back on. I think it has been amazing. The ability to travel with such a niche building type that we do get to travel around the world doing it. So that is great. I think the best thing about a stadium architecture is, of course, you can go back and visit it again and again.
Yeah.
You can't do that with private building types. Once they're done and handed over and the door's locked, it's someone else's private domain.
Mm.
But at the stadium, you can go back and sit in it and look at 30,000 people wrapped around you and go, well, we did this. I mean, it is a we, of course. There's a big team of a dozen or so people that would realise the stadium, but to be part of that team, buildings that are absolute landmarks in cities that everybody knows, make a huge impact. It's brilliant. It's absolutely amazing.
Do you have any anecdotes in relation to that? Like, is there ever a moment you're like, wow, I did that?
I think, oh boy, the opening ceremonies of stadia. There was we designed the Stade Océan in Le Havre in France, and we went along to the opening night, and I didn't know they were going to do it, but they just blacked out the entire stadium while we were in it, and did this amazing sound and light show. The people walking, streaming onto the pitch with lanterns and floating up in the air, and it was absolutely gobsmacking. And although we actually hadn't designed the opening show, to be part of the crowd with the oohs and the ahs and the wows of that show was just brilliant. So that, I mean, books, you can clearly tell it matters a lot to me and still does. No, absolutely no regrets. It has its highs and lows. It's stressful, but you wouldn't want to do anything else. But for me, it was completely my utter priority in life. But there's different priorities in life now, aren't there? I mean, there's social life and family life. There's a hybrid balance perspective I sense in the Gen Z.
In the Gen Z.
So how much does architecture absolutely is your world?
I think like I was very lucky in the sense that the friends that I found at uni, which was like my first dip into the pool of architecture, were all architects. So we tend to share the same passion for it. And whenever we're out and about, like we don't ignore it. And it's not just like very segregated in our lifestyles that it's friend time, it's architecture time, It's sort of like the perfect mix. So we can appreciate it while also not necessarily thinking about it to the extent of like a career studying, which I think we're pretty lucky to have. In terms of like family priorities, I think it still strikes a good balance. Like, I think that's a good thing about architecture, and it teaches you need to balance your time. So family and friends will always be supportive about architecture. I would say that they're both my priorities. Neither one weighs up more than the other, but it's good to balance out what I want to do with my time. And it doesn't, just because I'm focused on one rather than the other doesn't diminish how much the other means to me. That makes sense.
No, it does. It does.
Yeah.
But do you find yourself constantly walking around anywhere, inside a building, outside a building, just looking at the detail?
Yeah, I think so.
The while.
Yeah, all the while. And I think what really gets me is like detailing, like joints between materials. You always find like me taking a photo of like a wall. And then everyone around me is like, why are you taking a photo of a wall? Like last week I was at a pub and I took a photo of the roof. And everyone was kind of confused on why you're taking a photo of the roof. But it was like, oh, that might apply to a project I need to do. Like that's quite an interesting detail. And I think it's like focusing on the little things that are also as important as the big things in architecture, especially because there's so much that goes into it that not necessarily everyone recognizes or will think about on a daily basis.
Yeah,
and I think that's quite important.
I think we all do it. I still do it.
Yeah,
particularly details.
Yeah, details are good.
It's not whole buildings anymore. It's just a really crafted little detail. You think, oh, that's good.
Yeah,
they solved that really well. I could use that.
Yeah, I know.
Or I could learn from that.
Yeah. Definitely. So, like alongside all this, I guess detailing's always been important. Materials, facades, and the way architecture generally looks has been important. But in terms of the function, do you think like the focus on sustainability within architecture has changed throughout your career?
Well, it has. I mean, obviously global warming has focused everybody's minds. Not fast enough for us, is it? I don't think. Yes, it has, but I think we'd all agree we'd like more teeth in the legislation. Clients have too much options to really ignore the agenda, much as we push it. I'd like regulation to ensure that we really have to do the right thing all the while, every time.
Yeah. But do you think that like because technology's advanced throughout time, that like all of the passive energy sources or ways of like doing architecture have sort of been neglected just because there's newer technology out there that might not be necessarily as sustainable as it used to be?
I think the reverse. I think what we want to end up doing is having to apply the minimal amount of energy ultimately when a building's finished to make it work. So I
Hmm.
think absolutely everything you can do with the fundamental initial build
Yeah.
that is inherent in the basic characteristics
Hmm.
of the building is the priority, and then you tack on the minimum tech using the minimum energy. So no,
Hmm.
it's right
Yeah.
at the core of it still.
Yeah.
Yeah.
From your experience in hiring like part ones, part twos, do you think that they have a good knowledge on sustainability within architecture? And do you have hope that they'll implement those ideals that they've learned at university towards buildings?
Your generation is way more idealistic. Thankfully, still your bubble has not burst at all. I think you get it. Um, you get it, and it's obviously so much more relevant for you and your children and your future
Yeah.
generations. Uh, you're incredibly uh, motivated towards it, which is great to see.
So, aside from us being motivated and idealistic, what do you think we will really struggle with? Like, what do you think will be our biggest challenges moving forward?
Wow. Um, your biggest challenges moving forward, I think. Uh, two answers. Budget will always be your challenge. I think you'll find yourself constantly frustrated that your
Mhm.
clients never really want to spend as much as you'd like to spend
Yeah.
to make the perfect building that you have in your dreams.
Mm.
Um, I think weirdly, networking will be one of your biggest challenges,
Yeah.
just because the world is so disconnected in a face to face way.
Yeah.
I think getting out there and getting those face to face relationships is tougher these days.
Yeah, I think so. How because meetings prior to maybe even COVID, because everything became online after COVID. So prior to that, how were client interactions like?
Well, I think we were all at work 5 days a week,
Yeah.
and everyone socialised a lot. I don't know why that's declined. I think it's just declined because we're hybrid working. Um, but everyone socialised a lot after work, and there were a lot more corporate events. I think it's a little bit to do with general sort of recession pressures as well on corporate spend on networking events where everyone was regularly getting together face to
Hmm.
face, meeting and chatting.
Yeah.
That's declined. We need to bring it back.
Hmm.
So I'll flip it back to you then, your question to me.
Okay.
When you get to the end of your career,
Yeah.
put another 50 years or no, 30, 40 years on where you are now. If you can possibly imagine, your generation could possibly imagine that far ahead.
Good Lord.
What do you want to have achieved?
Um, I think I'd like to know. I think this is what goes back to what you were saying earlier, like to know that the spaces you've designed have actually made an impact on the people within them and be able to see that like throughout the building's lifespan it's being constantly enjoyed and know that everything like the experience of the space has not deteriorated over time and that your original design intentions are what everyone around you is experiencing within them. I think that makes sense. And I like going back to tech, I hope that like technology does not really diminish like the raw, I'm gonna say awesomeness, but that's a bit weird. But like the raw meaning of architecture and what it should mean. Like that not everything is high tech, that the people within the building should be able to appreciate that brick detail, should be able to appreciate the view and how strategic the view was for the window to be south facing so that at this point in time there's light sunlight, not just to rely on whatever technology, like the underfloor heating, oh, it's warm. Like to understand the passive functions of the building as well as anything else within it. That makes sense.
Now it makes perfect sense that the fundamental geometry, setup,
Yeah.
light quality, proportioning is all right
Right.
inherent in the basic building.
Yeah.
Because the tech will come and go
Yeah.
on a 5 yearly cycle.
Yeah.
What we bolt onto it is very transitional.
Mm-hmm.
The basic building has to be where the purity and the beauty is, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I completely agree.
Hmm. So, like what you were saying about clientele and how everything's sort of online now. Do you like? I guess it has its highs and its lows, and advantages and disadvantages. Do you think that social media, for example, because that's blown up, especially with my generation, has that any significant impact on architecture?
Um, yeah, I mean it's twofold. Social media and LinkedIn and Twitters and Facebook, it will be your initial method for starting all your contacts, new conversations.
Hmm.
It's almost like speed dating in a way. You end up with a whole bunch of online
Hmm.
conversations. Then ultimately you'll agree to meet up. Essentially, that's how
Yeah.
it works. Um, and you'll find that you'll hit it off and you'll forge sort of lifelong relationships. Um, as it affects architecture, I think things like Instagram, for those that are interested, and all your little detail photographs and things that you
Mm.
take. Um, there are too many millions of images out there now, constantly being shared. I don't know quite how much cool pictures of cool buildings get much traction these days in your generation, but I'd
I
hope
think
they
they
do.
do quite a bit.
I'd hope they
They do
do.
quite a bit.
That there is a buzz around quality architecture that
Yeah.
still raises interest, and that so yeah, the potential to share
Hmm.
a great building or even a great design in progress is massive if the media is used right.
I think because social media is so prevalent and people are really into traveling now, I guess, and like traveling is very accessible, and people run to social media for like travel tips and advice on what to see in different places. I think that buildings definitely are on a lot more people's like feeds and they're more aware of them because that's what's presented to them as like the ideal place to go. So I think there's definitely been an increased appreciation of like new buildings, famous architects, whatever, but also like the historical part of it, where you can see old ancient monuments and stuff like that. And I think that's maybe it might aid in the appreciation of architecture because I guess people are not exposed to what used to be. They're just exposed to what they know. So I think that's quite an interesting feature that social media has.
Yeah, maybe, but I think there's a bit of tick box tourism going on
Yeah,
where, hi, look, I'm at Machu Picchu, snap.
yeah,
Next picture, here's the plate on my food, and here's me in the
yeah.
bar. Tick, here I am at Chichen Itza. Don't know how many, say, 20 somethings are actually looking at the building other than saying,
Hmm.
yeah, been there, done, next place.
Yeah, there is a surface level to it. There's a surface level to social media. But I guess you can't always write off the people who actually appreciate it,
Yeah.
you know? Mhm.
Here's a classic question for any architect. Everyone always asks, um, which architects do you admire the most?
But like, I think like I started off wanting to be a product designer. So I think that's why I really appreciate detailing because like I was building like chairs and stuff at school, so you know how much goes into each part of it. You know how much prototyping needs to go into each element of a chair, for example. And then I went to Barcelona, and then I was able to see Gaudi's architecture.
Okay.
And then although like yes, Sagrada Familia, everything's amazing, like all his architecture's organic forms are wow, and it's nothing like you've ever seen before. I think what really struck me as interesting is that I was going down a staircase in one of his buildings, Casa Batlló. I don't know if that's how you say it. But then I was like holding the handrail and I looked down and it was carved to like match the way your palm moves, not like the generic way. But I was like, oh, like I think that's the first time I realized that in a building you can focus on even the little details. It doesn't necessarily have to be you building a chair. You could do a building, but have it be so people centered, regardless of the scale of it. And then I went further into Gaudi, and then he has his own door handles that are like molded to the shape of a hand and stuff like that. And then I think that's when I realized like I would rather do this on a bigger scale. I want to be able to design for people on a big scale, and I'm able to do that even with focusing on the details of it. Yeah.
That's funny. I thought you were going in a completely different direction with that because that is super fussy, super detailed organic architecture with lots of thought in it. I thought you were going to say, and then I went to the Barcelona Pavilion.
Oh
and
no.
fell in love with minimalist Mies van der Rohe, less is more, which is where I'm coming from. You know, the super reductive, thought about to the nth, to the point where the amount of thought is almost lost in the fact that it's so simple. But the fact it's so simple and so
Mhm.
minimalist is why it's so gorgeous.
Yeah. I guess we have different perspectives
Yeah,
on
yeah,
it, yeah.
yeah. No, I'm from that perspective. Yeah, yeah, that's fascinating. Great.
So you're a Mies fan then?
I don't think you can pigeonhole yourself after all these years. I absolutely adore what Frank Lloyd Wright
Mm.
did. Um, Went to the Guggenheim, blown away, super dangerous handrails down by your waist. You could tip over in a bit, but wow,
Mm.
what a piece of fundamental three-dimensional sculptural architecture. And considering the date he did that was quite gobsmacking. What he did in achieving what he did at I know it's a classic, the falling water, but the first ever use of reinforced concrete
Mm.
cantilevers, just to even think to do it was just amazing. But I'm a Foster Rogers Grimshaw acolyte. They were the gods in my 1980s
Mhm.
growing up. They owned the world. And of course, Foster still does, but they were all at the tech, reasonably minimalist, engineered, detailing glass and steel end of life.
Mhm.
I still love that as well. I love it.
What do you think of Björk Ingels' architecture?
I think you've got to give anybody credit these days that can actually reinvent something that seems so defined.
Yeah.
To We always think there's nothing new in architecture, but when someone comes along and radically reinvents something and goes out at the crazy end, but it's actually buildable and works, you got to say fair play.
Yeah.
Okay, that sort of time's up. That was fascinating. Um, Thanks for taking part. It's We ought to do more of these just general chats on perspectives because I've learned a lot about your
Gen Z.
your Gen Z and what you guys want out of life, which is stuff that we as the owners of the business ought to know intuitively. We ought to know.